The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Dylan Hayes, and I am the moderator for today's webcast. Today, Friday, February 6th, we will hear the presentation, Flexible, Innovative Zoning Techniques. For technical help during today's webcast, type your questions in the chat box in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen, or call 1-800-263-6317. For content questions related to the presentation, type those in to the question box also located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those, if time allows, at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. I want to thank our 2015 participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible. Today's webcast is sponsored by the Connecticut Chapter. For more information on this chapter and how to become a member, visit www.ccapa.org. To learn more about all the chapters, visit www.planning.org/chapters. To learn more about all the divisions, visit www.planning.org/divisions. On your screen is a list of upcoming webcasts. To register for these, please visit www.utah-apa.org/webcasts. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, visit www.planning.org/CM. Select today's date and today's webcast. This webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. Some recorded webcasts are available for distance education CM credit. For availability of distance education CM credits, check the webcast webpage at www.utah-apa.org/webcasts. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on upcoming sessions. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. A PDF of the PowerPoint will be available at www.ohioplanning.org/webcast-presentations. I'd like to now introduce our speakers, Kristen Sisowski and Donald Elliott. Mr. Elliott, I will now turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. I am going to, let's see, show my screen. There we go. Thank you all for joining us today. Kristen and I are looking forward to this. We're flattered to be asked to present this webinar. Today's topic, and it's scheduled for about an hour. We want to leave time for questions and answers. When you have such a broad topic like this, it's hard to know what to include. So Kristen and I went back and forth, and we have included a number of things that we think are current, and some of you may know some of them, and some of you may know all of them. But it's kind of what's happening now that we often get asked to talk about or incorporate in new codes. However, we certainly can't include everything that may have crossed your mind in this topic. So we're planning to leave time, run this about an hour, and then leave time for you to ask questions. And you may ask questions not only about the topics we presented, but also other things that you hoped we might address. And you know, it's kind of the kind of potpourri for 100. We'll see if we can get you an answer. So let's see if I can get this here. Am I on this screen? Subtitle today is "What's New in That Old Staid Field Zoning?" Well, there's lots that's new. Kristen and I work for Clarion Associates. We are a land use firm based in Denver, Colorado. We have office in Chapel Hill and affiliate offices in Philadelphia and Chicago and Cincinnati and Florida. But we're not a big firm. We're about 18 folks, planners and attorneys and recovering attorneys like me, and urban designers, landscape architects. The reason we are doing this is that our firm has worked with over 130 communities across the country, and as you can see, some in Canada and in other countries, to update development codes. The two classic cases are either a community has a new comp plan and their laws are out of whack with the comp plan, or they set of laws and zoning and subdivision has gotten so gummed up over time through stapled on additions that no one really trusts it to have any predictable outcomes, and now they have to say, look, how do we fix this and get it intelligible to human beings? We do a lot of work with hybrid and form codes, and I'm going to talk about that today. And all new codes these days are highly graphically illustrated, so that's it. Here's who we are. I'm a planner and lawyer with 27 years of experience. I should be proud or something to say that 20 years of those years have been with Clarion. I wrote a book several years ago called A Better Way to Zone, which is about how to simplify zoning codes and how to get the result more efficiently than you may be getting it now. A couple of years ago, Chad Meadows and Matt Goebel and I of Clarion also did an PAS report called The Rules That Shape Urban Form, which is about hybrid codes, basically how people are implementing form-based zoning tools across the United States. Kristen has the distinction of being not only a planner and a lawyer, but an engineer. She's a civil engineer by training, and she is one of the associates at Clarion. She and I draft development codes together along with other associates at Clarion. So that's who's speaking with you today. Let's get on to the topic. I want to talk first about, here's our outline. I'm going to talk about new types of codes. We get a lot of questions about form-based controls, and then move on to some new land use, ADUs, cottage and pocket neighborhoods, urban agriculture. This is kind of the broad outline. We're going to cover some other topics in between these, but this is a major one. And then some legal changes that are happening in fair housing and some innovative ways where people are thinking about how to address those changes. You can see them listed on the screen: fair housing, cell towers, and First Amendment. And then leave some time for questions and answers. So that's where we're going. You can see on the right the title of the cover of the PAS report, taken from the Stapleton development in downtown Denver, looking towards Denver, downtown in the mountains. And that's going to be the first topic we do, new types of codes. This was quite a research effort to say, let's get beyond the rhetoric of form-based code and say, how is it actually being used? And so we wanted to talk about that. Here's kind of what's going on here. I'm going to go backwards here. How did we get here? I think about zoning in terms of a dance, a 100-year-old dance between predictability and flexibility. Everybody wants both. When you're trying to do something with your property, you would like predictability or some flexibility. Your neighbor wants predictability, and when your neighbor's putting on a deck, they want flexibility, and you want predictability. So this idea that I want zoning to be predictable, flexible, well, we both want both, of course. The point is that zoning has done a dance over the past 100 years between these two concepts. It started off very flexible because, as you know if you've studied zoning, the early New York ordinance, the first citywide ordinance, was very simple. There were only 3 zones and some basic height and setback requirements. It was just a box within which you had to build your building, and some very simple uses. It started off very flexible. The tool swept the country in the 20s, and as we got up towards and through World War II, it became more and more rigid. People said, well, I don't really just want a residential zone. I want R1. I want all my neighbors' lots to be just as big as mine. Well, I've got a smaller lot, but I want all my neighbors' lots to be just as big as mine. We all know this dynamic. Everybody wants the only change in the neighborhood to be more wealthy people than them moving in. So over time, the number of zones and uses and controls got pretty complicated. And after World War II, we added a lot of parking, landscaping, lighting. All of a sudden, this very simple rule book got to have a lot of rules, and it constrained what you could do. It began to seem very rigid. It was very predictable. It just wasn't flexible. And the reaction to that was performance zoning, where people like Lane Kendig and others before him came in and said, look, the real goal here is not what do we call this use, but how does it act? Does it create odors? Does it create lighting problems? Does it create vibration? Is it open all night instead of just during daytime hours? Let's measure the impacts instead of calling it by a particular use. And as long as you don't create impacts, we're okay with it. That's more flexible. We're going to move towards how does it behave as a neighbor rather than what do we call it by name. That got us back towards flexibility. It turned out to be somewhat difficult to enforce for a couple of reasons we can talk about. One is that you're measuring impacts before the guy builds the building, but if he builds it and it turns out not to perform the way he thought, all right, now you got a problem because you have the impacts you didn't want, but the building's already been built. That's a tough situation to get out of. So basically, we came up with this performance zoning, and then the next step was PUDs, planned unit developments, negotiated zoning. This major breakthrough that said basically, why don't we just let people write their own zoning ordinances? They can write their own zoning. It was intended for kind of greenfield, innovative, flexible development, but big greenfield projects where you could do more density over here in return for more open space over there, give us more quality than we would have gotten normally. You give us something, we'll give you flexibility. As all of you know, whether you call it that or I'm down in Albuquerque today, they have used a different tool to get to the same place. Basically, you've got custom-made zone districts for an individual development or set of developments. And that's the ultimate in flexibility. You don't like our zoning? Well, write your own. All you got to do is convince City Council to approve it, and that's your zoning. That had its own problems, a little bit analogous to performance zoning. It's hard to administer. On the day you adopt it, everybody loves it because it's a perfect picture of what everybody could agree on. Often in terms of what they could agree on, the neighbors were only willing to go along with it if some very strict controls were put in. And the stricter those controls were written, the quicker you had to amend it because life doesn't ever turn out like the picture on the box. And so basically, we like it on day one. It's a snapshot of the future. The only thing we really know for sure is that the future will not turn out that way. So we're going to have to amend this over time. And staff gets driven crazy because there is no such thing as a generic PD. I know what B1 zoning is, and I know what B2 zoning is. But every time somebody comes in and they're in a planned unit development, I have to go to the files and look it up because I don't know. That's PUD number 203. I don't know what they said. Sometimes they were pretty poorly drafted. But it was highly flexible. So this is the journey we've been on. And now we have, now we've gone towards form-based zoning, which is clearly saying, look, let's not try to micromanage the uses, but let's get back to predictability by looking at the building form. Let's make sure the buildings fit in better to what's around them than we have in the past, not just an invisible box of height and setback. Let's look at the great places that we love and say it's the fact that they feel cohesive. They feel like there's a place here. Let's measure that, do it. But let them have a lot of flexible uses inside. Let's not micromanage the uses. Let's be flexible. And then let's be more sophisticated about how the building fits in, and then that's what we build. Now, it's clear that that's going to be more predictable than PUDs because it'd be hard to be less predictable than PDs. PUDs are, the neighbors often are the biggest objectors because you do not know what's going to happen on that vacant parcel next door. It is going to be whatever comes out of the negotiation with the developer and your neighbors. So this gives you predictability in a different way, not by micromanaging uses. Now, we don't know, if you look at the arrows, whether that's going to turn out whether it's more predictable or less predictable. That's the journey that we are still on, and the short answer is there's no answer. It depends on how you draft the form-based zoning tools. You could draft them to be really predictable. You could draft them so that it's a historic downtown, I'm going to make this up, San Diego, or some historic old town with a very distinct character, Miami, South Beach, and you get really tight about how you fit in with a really unique set of buildings, French Quarter of New Orleans. Or you could say, look, I want the buildings up to the street, and I don't really care beyond that. I just don't like parking lots. So it's up to you how you draft it. We don't know where that's going, but it is back in the direction of predictability. So that's the journey that we've been on. Here's another graphic. Basically, form-based zoning says, current zoning says, look, we've got uses, and then we spend a lot of time talking about uses, and then we talk about process, because you got to know, do I need to go to the Board of Adjustment? Do we need to go to Council? Who approves this? And we don't talk much about form. And the form-based movement says you got that just upside down. We should be letting people do a variety of uses because that's flexibility, and many buildings get reused for different things through their lives. So admit, this building is probably going to be something else before the day it's torn down. It'll house different uses. Process is process. We've got to go through, but let's have less of it. Let's tell people that the uses are flexible, the process is simple, we strive for by right development, but we do care about the form of the building. We are going to give you much more than just heights and setbacks in terms of how your building has to fit in. We're going to talk about distance from the street. We're going to talk about maybe articulation of the facade, entrances, transparency. There's a whole spectrum. As I said, you can do form-based light, you can do form-based heavy, but you are going to talk about form a lot more than you would in a traditional code. That's what's going on in form-based zoning. Now, the Form-Based Code Institute is the professional organization of folks who really study this new tool, and this has been happening for 20 years now, more than 20 years. Their list of what ought to be included in a form-based code is these things: building form standards, building type standards, frontage standards, public space standards, block and subdivision standards, and a regulating plan. These are very smart people, and they have done a lot of great work around the country, and many, many communities have adopted something with one eye on Form-Based Code Institute or the ideas behind it. They've been trying for 25 years to say, what is this new tool? How do you know when you're looking at it? And how do you know when you're not looking at it? And this is the kind of their list. How do we do? These are the things that make it different. And you can see these are form-type things. There's nothing on here that has to do with uses. A lot that has to do with buildings and how they relate to what's around them in the street. On the right-hand side, I've put the famous now graphic of the transect, which basically says there are six types of places, 7 types of places, and you ought to design your code around. Are you in transect 3, basically, post-war suburb stuff? Are you in transect 4, kind of pre-war suburb stuff, or pre-war housing? Transect 5, a sub-center of the city, or are you transect 6, downtown? To move things along, what is a building form standard? Sometimes it's a drawing that says, this is a downtown building, in quotes. This is, and often a form-based code has a table like this one. This is one that we wrote for Hamilton, Ohio. Instead of listing uses by zone, you could see that up across there is the Main Street 1, 2, and 3 zones, and the downtown 1, 2, and 3 zones, and then down the left-hand column, 6 different building types by name. Now those are defined in the code, and instead of filling in the boxes in the table by what kind of use you can do, the table is filled in with what kind of building you can do in that area. So just by way of discussion, if I want to do a parking structure in the MS1 Main Street area, I look across the bottom row and I say, I cannot do that. They will not approve it. Not because they said no parking uses, they're saying you can't do a parking structure in this area, and a row building has its own rules. Sometimes they're pictures. Frontage types, there's a lot of work's been done on how does this building relate to the street, and often they are defined too. This is a drawing of, they're crafted for individual cities. It's not generic. You go measure and say in this town, here's one type. It's a storefront. And the graphics, this is from the smart code on the right, often say, look, we can categorize this stuff. There are different kinds of frontages that work in this city in different kind of areas. And some of them work. You can look at the right-hand column. This type at the top box works in the T3 and T4 district. Down at the bottom, a very lowest thing, that kind works in the T5 and T6 district. So depending upon how walkable and urban the area is, different combinations of building types and frontage types work. So those are 2 of the elements. I'm giving you an example. I'm not walking through all 6 elements. Here we are. We studied all of these different towns and said there's a spectrum. Let's study 6 communities in the U.S. and see how they're using this tool. All the way from Austin. Now Austin's redoing theirs now, but this was pre the latest effort of Austin. So this is early Austin, Denver, pre the latest code, all the way to Miami 21, which is a very ambitious citywide form-based code. At the left end of the spectrum, you're kind of sprinkling form-based ideas into your code. And Miami is very close to the smart code, which is the most disciplined codification of these ideas anywhere. And we kind of went at it and said, let's study all the way from sprinkles to the whole thing. Here's what we found. If you look down the left-hand side, do these 6 cities, did the efforts that we studied, did they use building types? Did they define frontage types? Did they define public space standards like streets and parks? And form-based coding really treats streets as public spaces, which is a very wise thing to do. And then the other, you can read it for yourself. And then across the columns, each of the 6 cities. It's clear. This is a scattergram. This is not linear. No one of these 6 cities used all 6 of these elements. Many used 2, some used 5. Gray box means sort of. Blue means they used this. Blank means they did not do this. So what we found was not surprising. People are going into the form-based toolbox and picking the parts that work for them. There are very few examples out there of people who have tried to really swallow the whole thing. And even those that have, I want to be very clear, it's not one thing. They're always tailored. And the Form-Based Code Institute makes very clear there is no such thing as a form-based code that you do not develop through measuring your community and making this your own. The point we wanted to make through this study is brilliant ideas in form-based coding. It's the biggest innovative technique in the last 25 years in zoning. It's not one thing, and it's not being treated as one thing. It is being treated as a variety of good ideas that need to be selected for political acceptability in your community and then tailored to work in your community. That's the lesson. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just briefly, about conditional zoning. I had a question come in that said, Don, can you talk about, can we zone, I'm changing from form-based zoning, that's the end of that topic. Can we zone into a new zone district and say, we're zoning you from C1 into C2, but you can't do pawn shops? Can I put a condition on a zoning from one zone district to another? Because that would add some flexibility if I didn't have to go all C1 to all C2. The answer is it depends on your state law. I will tell you that it's very frequently used in one way or another. Many, many cities and counties out there do some version of this. They're very rarely challenged. Occasionally they are. Judges kind of understand if they don't let you do, if they don't say you can do C1 to zone to C2 and say no pawn shops, I'm just picking on pawn shops right now, then you're going to create a new district called C1P or C2P. C1 and C2 without a pawn shop. And that's not helpful. It is not helpful to push cities into micro creating districts just to make tiny nuances between them. And so you rarely see this question, is it legal? Check with your city attorney. Is it done? Yep, all the time. Neighborhood conservation overlay zones is another form of this, and we tell cities this all the time. When you rewrite your code, even if you do a great job defining urban context, you will find some neighborhoods that need special rules for their special character, and you better have a tool to do them. You better have a way when they come in and say, we are special. You do not want to say, no, you're R1, just like everybody else is R1, and they're going to say, nope, we're not, and we're about to call our counselor about this. So have a tool that you can draft special, tailored character standards that don't duplicate the code, but that supplement it and and have a place where you can do that. Now I want to be clear, don't do it all the time, and don't bury these things in a neighborhood plan. If you are adopting regulations, not good ideas and suggestions, but regulations which you intend to enforce differently in this neighborhood than that neighborhood, put it in your zoning code. Don't put in your zoning code, oh, to figure out what you got to do here, you got to go read the neighborhood plan because we actually buried the zoning in there. So don't do that. I'm turning it over to you, Kristen. Would you like to talk about ADUs?
I would. Good morning or afternoon, everybody. Well, Don nicely walked us through the evolution of our codes from a flexible state to a more controlled state, and now back to this hybrid state of flexibility. And so, assuming, like many of the communities that we work with, you're intrigued by form-based codes and you see the value in them, but you also are a big fan of uses because uses are a huge part of your existing regulatory framework. So assuming you decide to dive into a code update, and one of the main focuses is to include more flexibility, kind of like Don was just suggesting, other roads to flexibility. Look at a comprehensive review of your existing land uses and looking at which land uses you may want to extend to more districts or what new land uses you want to include is another way to infuse that flexibility into this new code that you're creating. So now we're gonna walk through a few new land uses that you're probably pretty familiar with. And when I see this new land use term, I pause because I think it's more appropriate to say existing land uses that are being repackaged or redesigned and retermed differently. So the first new land use that has gained popularity over the years, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and either you probably currently allow them or are considering allowing them in your code, are accessory dwelling units, and in other terms, granny flats, in-law apartments, carriage houses. And these are gaining in popularity in today's economy and our climate based on their size and location. Generally, they're a second size-limited dwelling unit accommodated on the same lot as another dwelling unit. And typically they're used, they accommodate the elderly, students, kids moving back home after college for a short period of time. They're essentially a mini infill project in a residential area. And in most communities, either allow them internally within the primary structure or externally in a garage or carriage house. And we see the value to both, and generally we recommend allowing both internal and external ADUs. So, okay, you've decided that this new land use is a good idea to include in your code. So how do you want to go about doing that to ensure that they fit within your existing neighborhood and community context? Oops, sorry, Don. Next slide, please.
All right, I'll do the next slide. Hang on. There we go.
Perfect. So there are a few very common standards that we see across the board and we write into our codes. Limit 1 ADU per lot. Limit the size to between 600 and 800 square feet. Now, there's always the exceptions. There's the tiny apartments or the micro apartments, or Hawaii is considering apartments in shipping crates, and so these are less than 400 square feet. And there's some, I mean, they could go up to 1,000 square feet, but the general size limitations are that 600 to 800 square foot range. And also, many communities, to alleviate concerns in specifically single-family neighborhoods, include an owner occupancy requirement so that the owner must reside in one of the 2 units. Now, this is something that could be applied across the board, but when you're considering allowing these in other districts that are not limited to single-family houses, and folks are interested in using them as income properties, that requirement can cause complications in terms of getting financing and whatnot. So with that last bullet point on the universal standard, I would say maybe tailor that owner occupancy requirement to single-family districts. And then other frequent standards are 1 parking space. And frankly, you probably don't even need to allow 1 parking space, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in the next slide. Generally, if folks are interested in ADUs, they're pretty environmentally conscious and sustainable, and they might not even have a car. Or it's your elderly mom or dad who doesn't drive anymore. So whether or not you need to require that parking space is up to you. Entrances, often there's a requirement that there's no entrance facing the street, and allowing ADUs on large lots. Okay, Don, next slide. So I started to allude to this, and this goes back to the owner occupancy requirement. But one of the biggest concerns that we hear, and you have probably heard as well, is that allowing ADUs will double the density in our single-family neighborhoods. Well, that concern is pretty unfounded, because a lot of properties just contextually can't accommodate them. Many property owners aren't interested in that second resident, and in participation, unfortunately, although participation is increasing, but overall participation has been low, and that is often due to the parking requirement. Some places require 2 parking spaces, and that's not necessary. Other things that have led to low participation is the cost of fire suppression, or including sprinklers in these ADUs, and any additional impact fees that may be tacked onto them. So when you're drafting your standards, these are things that you want to think about, maybe not including to allow for a more widespread use of ADUs.
Got the next one?
Yes, please.
All right.
So ADUs, we've seen that they're gaining in popularity, but they could be more popular. And so what's our best advice for really true? So you've written the standards, but you write standards for them to be used. So to make sure your standards are used, maybe not require that extra parking space. Don't include a relatives-only no rental clause, because it's unenforceable. How are you going to monitor who, in fact, is living in that ADU? It's kind of like linking parking standards to the number of employees. That's really hard to keep track of from a local government's perspective. Don't overregulate the design of because the existing housing stock is often too varied. Our neighborhoods have a great variety, and ADUs they're not cheap to include, and so the market will also help ensure that there's good designs going into the ADUs that are being built. And don't be afraid to take a risk. Take a chance on ADUs and monitor them and see how they work out. And if they're not being used, tweak them. It's part of the process, and our zoning codes, like we all know, are constantly requiring updates because we can't anticipate everything. But this is definitely a use that you're going to want to encourage for affordability and sustainability reasons. All right, Don, back to you.
Great. Let me make just a couple more comments. Good job, Kristen. I want to be clear on a couple things. One is when people say, you are ruining our neighborhoods, the appropriate response is, show me one place in America where this has had a significant negative impact on a neighborhood. All I'm asking for is one example, because I'm not aware of any, and most planners I know can't tell you any. This is a funny situation because it's a fear that is largely unfounded. Second thing to keep in mind, and the East and West Coast have had problems with this, be careful. We are having a serious affordability problem in America, and if you don't find a legal way for people to find smaller affordable housing, you're just going to drive it underground. We have a number of places where it says one family house, and there are 2 or 3 families living in there, or there's an illegal apartment in the basement. There are places that have done ADUs just to find a route to legalize illegal apartments. Be careful about presuming that you can keep rentals and double occupancy out of a neighborhood by denying ADUs. Be careful you're not just driving it underground. Cottage and pocket neighborhoods, another one. I just want to point this out. This is a growing thing. Small footprint houses, often in the little bigger 800 to 1,000 square foot range, usually on private streets because they're very narrow, designed to fit into unused and small and irregular parcels, infill parcels. Usually in infill parcels among single-family neighborhoods or at the edges between single-family and more intense areas. Think about, instead of saying, okay, you're in this zone and you can have X dwelling units, say, well, normal dwelling unit would have 2,500 square feet. Instead of saying that you can have 10 dwelling units, and we assume that's 25,000 square feet of gross floor area, I'm going to say you can build as many cottages as you want in this area, but you can't exceed the total 25,000 square foot gross floor area. I don't care if you do 10 at 2,500 or 20 at 1,200. I don't care. You design it. You bring it in. So the idea came out of the Pacific Northwest, and it's based on the fact that allow me to build no more square footage, but more units. Here are some visual examples of infill parcels that have been done out there. This is in Langley, Washington. 8 cottages on that 29,400 square foot lot, 11.8 DUs per acre. Oh, that's pretty high. Yes, it is. But the reason it works is that there's not a lot of it, and it's separated from other parcels of the same type, but it can turn these small infill parcels into sources of affordable and flexible housing. Good examples from the Pacific Northwest. Just Google Washington State and look up cottage developments or pocket neighborhoods. Same thing here. Here's another example. Danielson Grove Cottages, a site that would have had 10 7,200 square foot lots can accommodate 15 smaller lots. On the left is kind of what you do if you were trying to do a quick and dirty. On the right is what you could do if you were allowed to do more smaller units on streets that are admittedly narrower and going to have to be privately maintained, but you got some open space, you got some greens, you got some squares, you got some parking spaces, you got on-street parking. But basically, it's a pocket neighborhood that now accommodates many more folks. It's a great aging in place or aging in community tool because as people get older and they don't want to maintain the big house, but they don't want to move out of the neighborhood, this opens up a new non-multifamily, smaller footprint, single-family option. And but I want to be careful. It's smaller. But these tend not to be that affordable. This is not a cheap housing product. The successful ones have been, they're getting quite good returns. This is housing that has been very successful with moderately wealthy people or wealthy people. This ain't cheap stuff, guys, but it is innovative and flexible. Okay, often there's, you limit, if you're going to do floor area ratio, you limit it for the whole site, just don't regulate the number of DUs. Sometimes they limit it. Hey, give me flexibility. I promise not to build twice as many houses as I could have under the old rules. Often you have separation. You can't do one of these on this lot and then next to it and next to it. Now you're creating a whole neighborhood of these things. The point was it works because it's separated from other things by some distance. I won't read all of these. Often there's a 1 parking space per unit, or if you do a bigger unit, 1.5. It's usually smaller. Sometimes to get articulation, they have setbacks or porch requirements. Let's talk about urban agriculture. Kristen?
Great, thanks, Don. Well, so our final land use that we want to discuss today, urban agriculture, similar to ADUs, growing, the interest in allowing urban agriculture is growing at a lightning pace. And also like ADUs, while it's a new term, the concept is not new. Accessory gardening, like you see on the screen, it's always been okay. It's the only thing is that our codes didn't address it. And so now that we're seeing community gardens or rooftop gardens making their way into our denser areas, the issue of whether we need to regulate this land use has come to the forefront. And so essentially, urban agriculture, next slide, please, next.
Yeah. There you go. So
urban agriculture is essentially a marriage of 2 existing land uses. We had small-time gardening that you, your mom, your grandmother had historically done, and then we had farms in our traditional agricultural districts. Think tractors. So in our agricultural districts and our agricultural land uses were more isolated to separate, like we historically did, the impacts of noise and sound and odor. But now we are merging these 2 land uses in urban agriculture. Next click, Don. And we're seeing in urban agriculture come in many different shapes and sizes. Like I mentioned, ground level, rooftop, but we primarily see 1 to 3 these uses in 1 to 3 acres in size, and there's tons of benefits, which is why the use has grown so quickly. Urban agriculture can help us eliminate food deserts. It's growing the local food movement. It's bringing communities together, and it's a great use for many vacant properties that we're not exactly sure what to do with. So okay, how do we encourage urban agriculture? Next slide, Don.
Mm-hmm.
Do you need a separate urban agriculture zone district? Maybe, maybe not. There's 2 main approaches to allowing for this land use. And yes, one is its own zone district. And then the other way is to allow for the land use, whether it be a community garden, a small-scale farm, as a defined land use category that is allowed in some or all of your zoning districts. So, for example, Philadelphia doesn't go the zone district approach, nor does Dayton, Ohio. They both allow this use in many of the zoning districts. And on the flip side, Youngstown and Cleveland have created an urban agricultural district. So it comes down to an assessment. It comes down to your community and how you're looking to use this tool. In Cleveland, they wanted to have more control on which sites, because Cleveland and Youngstown both, lots of vacant properties. And so they were looking for more control over which of those vacant properties this would actually be the highest and best use. And the urban ag zone district is actually not the main approach to incorporating this land use. The more prevalent approach is to create defined land uses and allowing them across the board through your districts. The main question is who owns the land and what is it worth for other uses. All right, Don, next slide. So allowing gardens everywhere, it seems like a great idea that everybody can get behind. Again, it builds community. It makes us more active in a healthier community. But there's other associated land uses that you need to consider too. So one question is, can you sell produce grown on this land use on your property and off your property? So generally, can you sell the land use off your property? Yes. Can you sell it on your property? That answer is increasingly yes. But again, you're going to want to include additional standards like hours of operation. You're going to have to consider parking more closely if you're selling the produce or the product on the property. And then you're probably going to include some kind of stand from which to sell this property. So we recommend drafting use-specific standards that apply to the land use if you're going to allow the sale on the land. And then usually this includes processed food, and then there's a question of whether a business license must be required, and that is often the case. And then other things that you want to consider are setbacks and limiting the size of the stand that may be allowed to sell the produce. And another associated question with allowing urban agriculture are support structures like sheds, hoop houses, planting beds, compost bins, picnic tables, etc. And sometimes these are included but excluded, but oftentimes tools and equipment sheds are allowed if they fit a certain size regulations. And same with hoop houses. Height limitations are applied to hoop houses. And cold frames are generally allowed and usually subject to maximum total. And all of these structures are very routinely subject to maximum total lot coverage and setback standards. And then last but not least, one thing that you can't forget when you're considering urban agriculture is the soil safety question. In our efforts to be environmentally responsible, we still can't negate existing environmental contamination that's already on our land. So soil testing of these sites is a must for public health and safety reasons. Every site must be tested for lead, and then on commercial or industrial parcels, additional testing must be done for 5 other heavy metals, and you really need to confirm that they're within acceptable concentration levels. So the main takeaway with soils is that trucking in new loam and soil is becoming the norm to eliminate any health concerns. And I think that's it for the land uses, and now we dive into the fun world of legal consistency.
Well, yeah, and let me jump.
All your comments, Don, on urban ag.
Well, yeah, just a couple comments. That is this is one of the more, the soils question turns out to be kind of contentious, where it can be contentious, where you really have a misunderstanding. The folks that really like urban ag don't like this topic because they like, look, you're growing good stuff. It's homegrown. It's local. How, you know, it's got to be better than all the carbon and greenhouse gases driven or put in the air because we're driving the lettuce from California. And the short answer is when you go to the city attorney is not in the position to say, well, yeah, I agree with you. I really don't care what's in the soil. I don't really think it matters whether we get sued because we have got heavy metals in the produce that we sell and the city said it was fine. That answer is not going to be the answer you're going to get. So that's why I call this the ARG topic. Nobody wants to deal with it, but you have to deal with it. Youngstown and I believe Cleveland have established standards or cross-referenced the actual standards. It turns out to be hard to figure out which standards you should be using for safe consumption of these things. A lot of opinions out there. I'm just urging you as you get into this. I'm not encouraging you to stay out. Do get into this. You should. But do not think you're going to avoid the soils question. You will not be able to, and you shouldn't. You should not be creating a situation. Remember, up until a few years ago, lots of people use lead-based paint. Even if it was just a house, that lead's in the soil, and that lead is going to go into some vegetables, and you do not want to be the one who put set up that system where there's no testing required. Fair housing. Let's move on to legal issues and some changing things that are happening here. I want to do this fairly quickly. I'm spending more and more of my time in writing codes dealing with fair housing issues, and it is hard, and it might get much harder. Here are the sources. Many of you probably know Fair Housing Act of '68 is the source of this, but most of the interesting amendments happened in 1988. There are state anti-discrimination acts which often parrot the Fair Housing Act at the national level. In addition, you've got state zoning enabling laws which may constrain what kinds of housing or force you to require some types of housing in some types of neighborhoods, and then you've got group home statutes. And notice I popped this up. These are the sources of fair housing law that everybody is subject to. Why are we addressing this? Because local government is not exempt. These laws were aimed at real estate brokers and real estate lenders and rental agents and landlords, but they cover local government actions. Now, if you take money from the federal government, and many people do through CDBG programs, home programs, any of the HUD programs, you are subject to a higher level, not because Congress wrote it into the act, but because you agreed to that when you took the money from HUD. That is a different and higher level. That's why it's in its own category down here. Question. I don't take any money from HUD. Well, you are a rare bird then. Your community is an unusual bird. But if you happen to be in that category, so I don't have to pay attention to the Fair Housing Act because I'm not taking money from the federal government, right? Wrong. Wrong. You still have to comply with the Fair Housing Act as your zoning and building regulations. But if you do take money, you really ought to pay attention. Here are the classes that are protected. Most of the action, I think most of us know this: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and handicap. One of the things that many people don't know is that the courts have interpreted handicap is where all the action is because of how it's interpreted by the courts. It includes recovering drug and alcohol users. You need to not have discriminatory rules, regulations, and policies for the disabled. The disabled include former drug and alcohol users who are now in a recovery program. Don, does that mean I have to have a home for drug and alcohol addicts in my neighborhoods? No. Does it mean I need to allow group homes for people that are in drug and alcohol recovery programs because they're protected under the Fair Housing Act as I would other types of small living arrangements? Yes, probably yes. So, well, write to your congressman if you don't like it. That's what the courts have said. Also, HIV/AIDS is considered a disability. So we don't see very many of these at all, but if there are homes, small living environments for people by HIV/AIDS, and you say, well, that's not covered by the Fair Housing Act, you're wrong. It is covered by the Fair Housing Act. Here are the ones that are not. Sexual orientation, not yet. Although I'm having a nice back and forth with some folks in Idaho, and some HUD regional offices have come pretty close to saying that they will interpret the act as including that, for purposes of their regional administration of the act or the conditions they put on grants. So you might put a question mark after that, but you could, I will stick with the position sexual orientation is not a covered act yet. Homelessness is not, victims of abuse are not, income is not. Remember this, in America, it is not a federal, there is no federal constitutional right to get housing that you can afford. You may think that's completely wrong. My daughter does. There are lots of countries in the world where good housing is a human or a civil right. In America, there is no duty to make housing available under the federal Constitution at a price that everybody can afford. It's the policy of the U.S. government. But the fact that you have housing for more wealthy people and not for poor people by itself is not a violation of the Fair Housing Act. Income is not a protected class in America. It's a very broad definition of disabilities that's covered. A physical or mental impairment that substantially limits your activities, a record of having one in the past, being regarded as having one. So the fact that you can get a doctor to say this guy does not have a disability is not going to bump him out of Fair Housing Act protections if he is considered to have that disability or he had one in the past. Again, it doesn't include current use of drug or alcohol. But this is a very broad definition. What violates the Federal Housing Act? And there are three ways. One is disparate treatment. One is disparate impact. I'll talk about those two. The third is failure to make reasonable accommodation in your rules or reasonable modifications to a structure. Federal acts, typically not very clearly drafted, but those are magic words. Reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification. Look at the ramp picture. If someone walks in your door and says, I need to put a ramp on my house because my mother is handicapped, you better not say, well, you're not handicapped, your mother's, tell her to come in. No, you're associated. It protects people in that household. And you need to respond and make those reasonable adjustments. Now, it has to be reasonable, but you need to know the answer to this. You can either put it in your code or just have a policy. But the day somebody walks in and hands you that paper, you should know that under the Fair Housing Act, if you are asked to reasonably bend the rules or your zoning to accommodate this, you need to respond appropriately, and you need to probably make it an administrative decision. If you turn them down and go to court, you'll lose. Now, if it's unreasonable, I need to build an apartment building in a single-family district because that's the only way I can make my pro forma work, that's an unreasonable request. You can say, go buy land in an apartment district. You can't force something that really doesn't belong. But a ramp, a rule change, don't blow them off. If they say these magic words, you'd better listen to them and make a reasonable decision. Here are the things that can get you in trouble with this. I think I go here. Let's go back into this. Disparate treatment means, does your act specifically name a protected class and make it harder for them? You are in deep trouble because that's facial discrimination. Does the transcript of the hearing show that you turned this bill down or you adopted it because of an impermissibly, people testified, I don't want these people in my neighborhood. You are in trouble because that is part of disparate treatment is going to be not only what did I write down, but how did we get to adopting it? Both of those are there. That doesn't happen very often. Disparate impact is, does a facially neutral law unintentionally violate the Fair Housing Act? Well, this is what they look at for this. They look out for restrictions on who can live together as a family, look out for spacing requirements between your group homes that are not backed by medical evidence. You can discriminate in the federal law in favor of the disabled, in favor of families. You may not discriminate against them. So if you are spacing group homes, you better know in your own heart why that is good for the residents of those group homes. I will tell you that if you get to very big numbers like 1,500 square feet or 1,500 feet from each other, you could have a judge look at you quizzically and say, where's your medical study? Why do group homes need to be 2,500 square feet, 2,500 feet, 1,000 feet from each other? There's no magic number. I can't give you the number. Small numbers usually pass under the radar. Large numbers, just be prepared to look the judge in the eye. And I'll tell you what is not an acceptable answer. It is not acceptable. That's the most our elected officials would adopt. That is not a reason why you are doing this to help the group home environment and the recovery of those protected classes. You are not going to get away with that. So the fact that, and I know because I write codes, a lot of these numbers are political. Just be prepared to explain that to a judge, because the judge is going to look at the federal law and says, I don't see any exception for our local elected officials didn't want to adopt a good number. They wanted to adopt a bad number. There's no such thing in the Fair Housing Act. Be careful about special permits, because when you get into a special permit for a group home or a particular type of, is it illegal? No, they're often upheld. Be careful. The criteria to approve them had better be planning criteria, traffic, parking, impacts, because if you're not careful, special permits about group homes turn into discussions about the people who are going to live there. You have no control over what the public's going to say or your elected officials are going to say when that comes up. But if they say the wrong thing, now you've got a record of facial discrimination. This is not neutral. You adopted this because people were looking at who lives in here and do I like them. Now you're in trouble. So the best answer is don't do that. Look at your state definitions of who's developmentally disabled, because often it is different than the federal definition. The best practice, I think, is to align your local definition of who's disabled and say, whatever the federal government and the state government say is a disability, we say is a disability. Those are the types of group homes that we're going to allow on the same basis that we need to under the Fair Housing Act. Quickly, I want to go, there's a new rulemaking in federal housing. I've gone too long on this, but HUD has proposed a new rule. It has gone through the comment period. There were many comments about it, and it is a big change in how you have to certify that you are in compliance with the Fair Housing Act if you take money from the federal government. I'm now changing into this, okay, is this the law or is this the law if I take money? It is the proposed rule that would apply if you get CDBG or home funds. It's not the rule, but it is well down the path towards being a rule. The comment period's over. It's heavily data-driven. There are lots of analyses that need to be done about concentrations of poverty and racial minorities and protected classes. You're going to have, and the HUD is going to give you a bunch of maps. You need to either use them or supplement them, but you can't ignore them. You're going to have to either say, I think your data is wrong, here's my data, and here's why I think it's better. But you're not going to be able to say, I decided not to use your maps if this rule is adopted. Here's what they're focusing on. Integration and segregation, concentrations of poverties. Who has access to community facilities like good schools and jobs? Why are all the poor people away from the jobs? Why are all the minorities away from the jobs? Disproportionate housing needs. Now these rules, again, have not been adopted, but you're going to get maps like the ones I've shown. Where are the racial and ethnic concentrations in your neighborhood? You look at the left-hand map, it's kind of like looking at an x-ray. Not too bad, got some things I got to explain. Right-hand map, I think I got a problem. Because you're going to have a question as to how come, why, what is. Now, you don't have to fix all the past, but you're going to have to explain what policies you have evaluated as to whether your policies are leading that to happen and what you're going to do to not make that worse or make it better. So there's a lot of data from HUD. There's a process, and HUD's going to have you go through that process. It's not the rule, but some version of it may become the rule soon. Kristen, let's go ahead with cell towers.
Great. Changing gears to cell towers, a land use that we can't live without, but we generally don't want to live with either. By now, most of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the 1996 amendments to the Telecommunications Act, which have generally set the stage for the current regulatory framework surrounding your review of cell tower siting applications. So because there's been some recent, very recent updates that have clarified provisions to those 1996 amendments, we'll quickly refresh our memories about what those amendments in 1996 did. And so the amendments to the Telecommunications Act both preserved and limited your authority to site cell towers. And there were substantive and procedural limitations. The procedural limitations required local governments to act on applications within a reasonable time, and the other limitation was that you were required to put a decision to deny an application in writing supported by substantial evidence. And recently, as you're probably aware, terms in both of those provisions have been interpreted by both the FCC and the Supreme Court. So as it goes with the law, these provisions are continually being clarified, which brings us to our first slide that you've been staring at while I've been babbling on. So in 2009, the providers raised the question of what this reasonable time period for local government review of applications was. And it was determined that a rebuttable presumption for co-location applications, so co-locations are putting an additional antenna array on top of an existing tower or other structure. So a reasonable time period to process those applications was 90 days. I think you'd all agree that you can do that within that time frame. And for new tower applications, 150 days was the rebuttable presumption. And this is important because the Supreme Court affirmed those time frames in the City of Arlington, Texas case in 2013. And most recently, under the Spectrum Act, these time frames were looked at again, specifically the co-location application time frame, in terms of co-locations that did not substantially change the physical dimensions of an existing tower. So now moving on to our next slide. So that FCC, the shot clock order was in 2009. And then fast forwarding to 2012, when the Telecommunications Act was again amended under the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, which also tried to make wireless deployment more efficient. And in doing so, one provision called the Spectrum Act stated, a state or local government may not deny and shall approve any eligible facilities request for a modification of an existing wireless tower or base station that does not substantially change the physical dimensions of such tower or base station. Now, reading that raises a lot of questions because there's not one, but various vague and undefined terms. Eligible facilities, modifications, substantial change. And this was concerning because this provision can significantly restrict your review of co-location. So just this October, the FCC adopted an order to clarify many of these terms, and we are just here going to focus on the clarification of what a substantial change to tower size is, because the feds consider these co-locations no big deal, and they must be approved. And additionally, they must be approved not in the 90-day time frame, but within the 60-day time frame. So if a co-location application comes in that does not increase the tower height by 10%, the antenna array is less than 20 feet, the tower or base station will not be widened by more than 20 feet, 4 or fewer cabinets are proposed, and there's no excavation beyond the site, then within that 60-day time period, you must approve that co-location.
Ready to go on?
Yes, I am ready. And so, even more recently, the Supreme Court, well, so also again, hearkening back to the 1996 amendments, the procedural provision saying that any local government decision of denial must be in writing has recently come under the microscope when a planning commission in Roswell, Georgia, they suggested approval of a cell tower. It was going to be a stealth tree tower and of a certain height, and there were conditions put on this tower for additional screening and buffering with natural trees. And so with these additional conditions, they recommended approval to the city council. However, the neighborhood was very vocally opposed to this cell tower application, and based on the neighborhood opposition and city council findings of incompatibility, they denied the application. And in in this denial, rather than including in writing the reasons that they found to deny the cell tower, they simply referred back to the transcript. And so the cell tower provider, it was T-Mobile, I believe, challenged this and said that that in-writing requirement of the Telecommunications Act was not met. And this is something that the circuit courts have been split on. Some have found that just referring to your transcript is fine. Others want more detailed, substantial findings of substantial evidence included within the actual denial itself. So this went to litigation, and the district court said no, finding for the provider. You can click through, Don.
Okay.
The district court said no. The Roswell, Georgia, you did not adhere to the Telecommunications Act. So the community appealed, and the appeals court said yes. We found that referring to the transcript was adequate, and so the Supreme Court recently heard this case in November, and the decision just came out last month. I think it was January 14th, and they decided, and they agreed with the appeals court that yes, a local government can refer so they decided whether referring to the reasons in a transcript adheres to the in-writing requirement, and they found yes, but the reasons must be contemporaneous with the denial. And so essentially this was reversed and remanded back to the circuit court because they really did not believe that within the transcript there was substantial evidence to justify the reason for denial. So,
great. Let's move on so we can First Amendment issues a little bit, because this is an area where we find that many codes, I mean, first of all, the range of uses that may be protected by the First Amendment keeps expanding, maybe unfortunately for those of us who have to write codes and regulate, but here it is. I want to talk about time limits. When you get what uses are protected by the First Amendment? Well, signs, of course, are free speech. Adult uses are off. Some types are free speech. Religious institution is, of course, freedom of religion. Though they have additional levels of protection. And here's the problem. Unpopular applications, the megachurch, the strip club, the billboard, tend to get delayed. Community hates it. Code may allow it. Let's kick the can down the road a little bit. Let's study this a little bit more. Maybe we can negotiate with these guys and get them to change the application. The problem is, unlike some routine 7-Eleven store, making it difficult to get a decision about your First Amendment rights and the exercise of it has a quote-unquote chilling effect. So, I move to continue this again. Can't do that. The courts have started to deal with this issue by saying zoning codes have to have a time limit within which applications for adult uses and signs have to be made, i.e. just like the Telecommunications Act, they haven't said 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. There are several court cases that say there better be a time limit. Even if you don't have one for routine permits, you need to have a code that says we will make decisions. Our planning commission or our staff will make decisions on these types of applications within these many days. Again, they haven't set the time yet. If there's an appeal, meaning if you go to the courts, well, you can't tell the judge when to decide things. He's got to juggle his court calendar. You're not in control of that. But if the appeal goes to a board of adjustment, and that's who's going to hear the appeal from your staff decision, that needs to be a time frame too. They will decide the appeal. The things that are within the city's control as to the timing of the process. Now, you can deny it, but you can't kick it down the road. If you think your code allows you to deny it, that's fine. Deny it within 30 days, 60 days, pick your number, whatever is reasonable given your time frame. If they appeal it, give them a time frame to do it for these types of uses, even if you don't have them for other ones, because they need to get a decision. That's the bottom line. Well, Don, we don't believe in time frames. Well, you better believe in time frames when it comes to here, or just hope you don't get sued, because if the guy that applied for one of these types of uses has read his cases, or his lawyer is, he's going to say, hey, where's the time frame? by when will I get a denial or an approval that I can appeal? So there we go. I want to also point out that when you're regulating adult uses, most codes kind of take a very strict view. They're highly unpopular, and we treat the case law came out of adult theaters. Most studies on litter, crime, loitering come out of adult entertainment, meaning theaters and strip clubs. Very few studies on secondary impacts have addressed adult retail. I'm taking a picture of La Bakerie Sensuale near my house in Denver. Well, they sell cakes and pastries and stuff that have provocative sexual messages on them. Who knows what they use them for, bachelor and bachelorette parties, I guess. But the point is, very few places have studied and says, does a store that sells cakes with adult-themed cakes or adult-themed books, do they create litter, crime, etc.? And very few studies have done it. Increasingly, cities are distinguishing those two uses. We have adult retail, we have adult entertainment. The studies will back you on more things on adult entertainment because the secondary effects have been documented. All your regulations of adult uses need to be based on studies. You don't have to do fresh studies, but you need to be based on documented impacts because your only right to regulate them is because of crime, litter, trash, whatever the secondary impacts are. Just be aware when you start treating adult retail like adult entertainment, you're on fairly thin evidentiary ground as to the fact. I mean, if you ask me, I haven't done a study. This is right next to Starbucks. It's right next to, I go to the Starbucks, haven't been to the bakery yet. But is it trashy? Nope. Is it a crime center? Nope. I'm not quite sure there are any separate higher secondary impacts from this adult retail use. Let's talk marijuana. We didn't say we were going to do that, but it's our humorous ending to our presentation. Kristen and I are from Colorado. In the right-hand corner are Cheech and Chong. So innovative flexible zoning. Colorado has legalized medical marijuana in 2000, recreational in 2012. Both of them required a very substantial involvement of time from the state, and then the state actually allowed local governments to make many of their own rules on this at both the state and local levels. And this is, just in case you're wondering about it in your own community, it involves both business licensing and land use. It's both things. Do I have authority to run a marijuana business? They're going to look at it the same way we look at, do I have the right to run an alcohol sales? Well, it depends on what kind of a guy you are and what you've done in the past. So it takes a lot of effort. It's much more complicated than you think because it's not just a place to buy a joint. It is growing operations, testing, transportation to get it from the place where you grow it to the place you sell it, distribution, and then retail. So it's at least five different links that each have to, the more you stare at it, the more you say, this is kind of an industry, and we need to figure out how we regulate the different parts of the industry. By the way, that's Cheech and Chong not too long ago. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Here are the very basics of how Colorado has done it because it's most entertaining. Yes, you can ban them. Colorado says if you don't want this, you don't have to do it. The right to possess does not include the right to grow, test, distribute, sell, or buy in a specific location. Consider buying a car. I probably have a right to buy a car. It's not illegal. That does not mean I can force your town to accept a car dealership. It is not true that every 100-person village has to allow industry just because it's legal to buy the stuff that industry sells. So the distinction is if you don't want a part of this, you don't have to. States license them. The state has to, you have to pay taxes to the state. But most of the regulation is by locals. In Colorado, they've authorized pretty heavy taxes at the local level. The important thing for you as a land use person to know is most of the places that have gone down this road in Colorado do most of their regulation through licensing, not through space. There's some basic spacing from schools and churches and parks, things that go on. The real enforcement is, look, you have a license to do something that has potentially adverse impacts. There are a lot of rules. You've got to be reauthorized every year, and we're going to inspect, and we're going to make sure you're following the rules. And if you don't get the rules, you are going to be shut down as a business. This is a retail business. It meets the spacing requirements. That's fine. But a lot of the things that could be done through zoning are now being done through licensing. There we are. No smoking in public ever. There we go. I'll just put these up and we'll wrap it up. Basically, how the counties have done it, most places tax them, so there's a revenue impact. There's some state straight line spacing requirements. Some counties say that's fine, but you're not going to sell this with alcohol or tobacco, food or beverages. It's its own thing. Lots of building security requirements enforced through licensing. They say we are not selling to people that don't show up with a Colorado license. Not everybody does it. And then in Denver, they allow it pretty broadly in zoning. There are spacing requirements, and then there's a hefty annual fee and quite a bit of taxation. So in case you were interested in these Colorado folks talking about marijuana, that's what we had to say. Sorry we ran over. Hope you found it informative, and I'll turn it back to our moderator.
All right. Sorry about that. All right. Thank you, Donald, and thank you, Kristen, for your time. We're going to take a few questions here. We might not have time to get through them all, but we'll get through as many as we can. All right. The first question is from Lenore. Is the administrative remedy for requesting a use not permitted still a variance from the Board of Adjustment? How is that exception assimilated into the big picture?
The general, and I think I understand the question, and that is if you need an exception for a use that was not, you've got a zoning ordinance, and it says these uses are by right, and these you need an exception for. I think the question is, does that still go to the Board of Adjustment? If you allow, let me say this, if you allow, if your code lists it as a use that could be allowed in that district if somebody approves you, yes. Older codes, and basically closer to the East Coast, say you go to the Board of Adjustment. That's what they're there for. Historically, the oldest codes say that question, can you do it? We said you might be able to do it. Can you make the showing that you can do it? Who decides? Yes, Board of Adjustment. Very, very often. Does that? It varies because home rule can write their own rules on this stuff. We also see a number of jurisdictions that say, no, the Board of Adjustment really decides variances pretty well, and they decide appeals well, but they don't decide conditional uses. That has a lot of planning judgment. We're going to send that to the Planning Commission. So is it normal to go to the Board of Adjustment? Yes, in older codes. If the newer your code is, the more you thought about it, and in the center of the country, or you often send it to the Planning Commission instead. Let me say this to be very clear. The norm is to say, if you are not listed in our code as a use by right or a special exception use, you may not go to the Board of Adjustment and get that use because you want to ask for it. Now, older codes, and in some states they do, but in general, the newer the code, and in most of the country, if you say, I need a use that nobody else in this district has, and I need, it's not listed as a use that I could have, I just need it. That's the only way I can make this go. Some states make the Board of Adjustment, give them that because that's the only relief. Increasingly, many states say, no, no, that's a zone change. You may not get, in my experience, the majority of codes say you can't get an unlisted use in that district just by going to the Board of Adjustment. We do have a relief. It's called go explain to the City Council why you need a rezoning, and that's the only way to make a viable use of your property, but that's a council decision. That's not a Board of Adjustment decision.
Okay, our next question is from Thomas. How would you handle lots approved for accessory residential structures when later the property is sold and then becomes rental property?
Well, again, it's a good question, and it comes up all the time. First of all, we didn't put it on the slide, but in addition to requiring occupancy, the owner occupancy of one of the two units, all the codes say you may never separate these two lots. You'll never be able to sell the unit, the accessory dwelling unit, separate from the lot, and will not approve you splitting the lot to create a separate unit. Kristen talked about how you can have a no rental clause, but it's very hard to enforce. It's the only way you can do that through a zoning Gestapo. Neighbor complains, you got to ring the bell, say, who are you? Are you the owner? Are you renting? No, I'm not renting. It gets very intrusive. Most places don't like it. So the norm is to say, we better ring on one door. It's not intrusive to say, are you the property owner? Because the law says you got to be the property owner. That's okay. People can show that their ID, I am the property owner. I live in one of the two units. They allow rental of the second one. I think the question is, what if I retire, I live over my garage, I rent my house, and someday I have to go to a nursing home, and now I sell the property, and the new owner says, yeah, I know I got to live over the garage, but I don't want to live over the garage. I'm going to turn this into a rental property. That's a zoning enforcement question. At that point, as I say, you are trying to figure out who lives in there, and the cities that do this just say, we are going to accept the fact that if we get a complaint that the owner is not living in either one of these units, we're going to have to send a zoning inspector out there and say, guys, the registered owner of this property is Joe. Which one of you is Joe? Oh, neither one of you is Joe? Joe's getting a citation for a zoning violation. There is a level of intrusiveness in it, but generally people are willing to do that because they're comfortable with the ADU as long as Joe lives on the property. It's his property. He will be a good neighbor. He's always been a good neighbor to us. But we're not willing to have two rental properties, and the only way to prevent that is to do what I've just said. You've got to be willing to actually go up there and say, which one of you is Joe? I'd like to see some ID.
All right. The next question is from Christine. How has technology changed the zoning requirements?
A whole lot. Next question. No, I'm kidding. Well, let me say two or three things. I'll say two or three things quickly because we could talk a whole time about this. All new codes are put on the web. Increasingly, things like VIC code or Encode 360. There are very sophisticated web-based search tools that allow people to really access information a whole lot more. Increasingly, also, the web tools will let you pop up commentary boxes that say, this is not the law, but if you want to see a picture of what we're intending or a statement of what this is supposed to do, here it is. In case you were, instead of having to call the planning office, here's what we'd tell you. So it's a very flexible tool in terms of interaction. In terms of technological uses, the trend in zoning is to use fewer, broader land use categories to avoid the and this is true in form-based zoning and in non-form-based zoning. Every single client wants uses defined more generally. So instead of trying to name, for example, I want to have an incubator for tech businesses. Don't do that. That's just an office use. Don't name each one that's coming out. Make sure that the definitions of your broad uses are broad enough to include the things that are coming up that are new and you never heard of them before, but don't create a new name for it. Just include them in your definitions so that they automatically get included. Third answer, it's made it impossible to list all the things you could do as a home occupation. Instead of trying to list what you can do as a home occupation, list what you can't do. Retail sales, often in some places you can't do auto repair in your driveway. Many places say you can't sell guns out of your house because you can't sell anything out of your house. List the things you can't do. You can't get anything that's going to take more than 5 FedEx trips a week or a day. Technology means so many people work out of their houses that you will never be able to name them all and regulate them all. You need to turn your home occupation regs on their heads to say what you can't do. But many of the sexy things that are coming up that people can do as work on their web don't need to be named as new and separate uses. Their land use impacts are very similar to other uses that you already have.
Okay, and since we are pressed for time, we do have to end at 12:30. This will be the last question. It's from Gregory. Do you think the oldest and most aggressively depopulating cities, say Detroit, will one day contain large former urban areas which have been essentially returned to agriculturally dominant zones as they were used in the early 19th century?
Well, good question. That's a very, very articulate question. Will we ever see people moving into Detroit because they need farmland? I don't think so. I mean, as Kristen explained, if you're moving into a big old city, there are issues of soil, and at some point you can truck in soil for a community garden or an urban agriculture. You can't truck in 1,100 acres of soil. You can't do that. The answer is we will see, I think, cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, other cities that have had significant vacant lands, be willing to be very innovative. And by the way, those cities that I just named have almost had an internal competition among themselves as to who can be most welcoming to urban agriculture. They want to be known for that. So yes, they open up new possibilities. Yes, people are taking advantage of some of those possibilities. Will we see more areas used for agriculture? Yes, I think so. It will be cities. The problem with those kind of, it's not a problem, it's a challenge, is this. Cities may grow from the middle out, but they shrink in a Swiss cheese pattern. So the patterns of vacant lands that you can do urban agriculture on are not contiguous. And Detroit and other cities have found the attempts to move people around so that you've got people over here and vacant land over there, highly controversial, difficult to do. So you're going to get a Swiss cheese pattern of vacant lands. Will it be used for agriculture? Increasingly, yes. Will it be the scale that you'd look at it and say, wow, it looks like Detroit before we have it? No, I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. Once
Don,
again,
I would chime in there.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kristen.
No, I was just going to chime in response to that question, saying yes. Many of our mature cities have a plethora of vacant parcels, but they also have the great bones, like we see for TOD development and other mixed-use development. And so urban agriculture is one great option, one great sustainable option, but there are tons of other sustainability provisions that are exciting to work into mature cities that have other site constraints as well, to reinvigorate that existing urban lifestyle that was traditionally known in some of our best cities. So I too think it was an interesting and good question, and I want to see more urban gardens in our cities, but I don't think it will go to that extreme.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank Kristen Sosowski and Donald Elliott for leading this discussion, and I would like to thank everyone for participating as well. I will remind you that these webcasts happen on a regular basis, and to register for future webcasts, please visit www.utah-apa.org/webcasts. You can find a recording of this webcast by searching for it on our YouTube channel. You just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and it should come up. And a PDF of the PowerPoint will also be made available at www.ohioplanning.org/webcastpresentations. Thank you again for your time and have a great day.